Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to our black and white conversion masterclass, which is, that one there. So if you are watching this, that means that you intended to learn about black and white conversion, mostly in Capture One. We're going to cover some other stuff too, but that's what this session's about. We're going to spend the next 90 minutes, roughly, talking about how to get the best out of converting an image from color into black and white within Capture One. Now, the reason I'm sort of heavy on the word conversion is that we're going to talk specifically about the way that you take color data and transition that into monochrome data. That's not the same as shooting in black and white. And we'll talk about that probably in a little bit, just in terms of the differences. But that's what we're here to do. So welcome to everyone that is online and live right now. I can see loads of you who are up, including people that are up at 4 o'clock in the morning your time. So well done, guys. For those of you that are online, please answer questions, put in comments, put in things that don't make sense, that do make sense. If you've got your own idea of something that might work, then put it in. Make this as interactive as you can, because I won't have covered everything. I'm pretty sure of that. And there may be things that you guys have in mind that you want to try and pick up specifically. For those of you that are watching this in the future, hello to the future. Must be weird there right now. But obviously you can't necessarily interact live. What you can do is put stuff into the comments field. This link will remain live as long as you have it. So put in stuff into the comments field, and if necessary, we'll come in and try and answer stuff later on. So, all that said, there we go. That's our intro done. We are today, as of right now, the point of recording, using the latest version of Capture One that's available to us publicly. So that's 15.3.1. If you're on a later version of Capture One, there may be slight differences to how things are working. And I'll cover some of the stuff that may change in the future, actually. So that'll be interesting if you watch this back in the future, whether I was right in the past. This is going to get very complicated. But in the meantime, this is the version that we're using. So this is the version that all the tools that I'm talking about will relate to, and the version that's going to produce all of the exports and so on from there. So that all said, where do we start? Where do we start with black and white? Well, we're going to start in 2014, and we're going to start with a quote by a very famous bloke called Paul Reefer. Who's not very famous, but it was actually a bit of a joke. So I was shooting with a friend of mine. This is how I treat my friends. And he took a picture and it was dull. And I said to him, genuinely, that'll look good in black and white. And he took it as an insult, and it was kind of meant as an insult at the time because it was a pretty dull color shot. And when you're used to shooting in color, we're used to shooting, we're looking for things. We're looking for skies that erupt on fire. We're looking for bold, sunset colors. We're looking for bright city lights with all the different hues and all that sort of stuff. And when we don't have them, it's almost like, to a color shooter, well, if it all goes wrong, then at least I can convert it to black and white. And it's almost like a secondary thought. But interesting timing, Tony. I'm going to put your comment on the screen. My experience is that shooting with intent to convert to black and white creates better images than trying to rescue a mediocre color image. And actually that's where I'm going to come from in this session, because you can go and buy a black and white camera, an achromatic camera. The range of cameras that I use from phase one, there is the achromatic version. It shoots purely in black and white. You have no choice. There's no color sensors, no color filters on the sensor. It's literally a black and white or monochromatic sensor and camera. And that means that when we're looking for things to photograph, what we're looking for are slightly different elements to what we're looking for in color. Now, these are not rules. They're not physics laws. They're probably scientifically incorrect, but what they are, having tested this over many, many years, the standard processes that I see people go through when they look at a picture. And that's because in both cases, whether it's color or black and white, our eyes seem to be drawn to contrast and shape first. But then there's a massive, great big break, almost like a tree. And when we shoot in color and we produce in color, what we next see from that contrast, we look for the shape, and that's the bit that grabs our attention. But then we look at hues and saturations and take, for example, a sunset. That's what we get drawn to, right? Then we look at the textures in the colours, because you can get light green, dark green, whatever else, and all of the different variations within the colours add texture. And then we see noise, and unfortunately in colour photography, generally speaking, noise is noise, an unwanted thing. So what happens when we go to black and white? Well, when we produce a black and white image, we still see contrast and shape and all that sort of stuff first. Of course, that's the bit that grabs our attention. But because there is no hue and saturation to follow, what we're then drawn to is the difference in tones. So it's this old thing about, I know it's seen as a bit of a cop-out by some people, which is, remove distractions and you focus on the key elements of it. But actually it's true. In black and white terms, by removing the option or the ability to focus on different hues, different saturations of colours and different elements, and we're just focusing on tonality and the differences in those areas, our mind becomes more focused. So when we look at a picture, we tend, in black and white terms, to see detail much quicker. So it goes from contrast straight to detail and micro contrast and texture. Whereas with colour, it goes from contrast and shape straight to boom, colourful, not colourful, muted, vibrant, and all that sort of thing. So when we start describing colour images, we talk about how vibrant they are, how muted they are, how almost low contrast sometimes we say, but we talk about them being cool or warm or neon or classic coloured. When we talk about black and white images, we tend to start talking about the things in there quicker. So we start talking about the texture, the shapes, the contrast between different elements in that picture, because we don't have the color distractions. And then the winner is, and whether this is right or wrong, in black and white we don't call it noise, we call it grain, because that has a nostalgic feel to it. It makes us feel better about the fact there's noise in the picture. But there is an argument that says quite often you'll see black and white images have noise added, the reverse to what we would do ever in a color image, but having noise in addition to what was already there as grain in what was the film, but now digital, to give it a sort of I guess a classic look or an older look or whatever else. So those two elements come away from each other the second we break from that initial impact of an image, which is contrast and shape. The second we move from that color image is assessed by our brains on a completely different set of rules to a black and white image. And that's why some people prefer to shoot, well, purely in black and white, and actually monochromatic cameras in some cases, because it forces you to look for different things. Now, this is where, unfortunately, I then break away from that nostalgia and say, I can always take a color image and convert it to black and white. What I can't do is take a black and white image and convert it to color. So while the black and white backs tend to be very, very good, and especially we'll talk about bit depth later on, so a dedicated black and white digital back or a sensor or even film in that sense can produce a better image than the color version that's converted. To me, it's about flexibility. I can take a color picture, convert it to black and white, and I'm happy because I've got both options. So I'm giving myself flexibility at the point of capture to not corner myself into how I'm going to produce the output. So that's why we're going to talk about conversion today, because it's about getting the best out of the flexibility that you've got within the camera. Let's go into Capture One. Where are we? So let's start our black and white session with a colourful sunset. So this is, for those of you that have followed along, this is one of the shots out of Iceland that we did with Capture One a while back. Now, when is it a good time to convert to black and white? Well, probably not now in this case, in this picture. This is a picture of a sunset. The thing that makes this picture stand out is the colour in the sky. Again, think about that tree. So we go from shape. There is obviously this black church in there. So if I sort of squint my eyes or close them and then quickly look at it, the first thing I see is the shape, the contrast. But then instantly what I see is that colour in the sky. Now, without doing any changes at all to any tweaks that we're going to run through later on, I'm just going to tick the black and white box in Capture One. And you'll see what I mean. We still get this shape, but it's not texture that's making this image interesting. It's not detail, it's not contrast, it's that color in the sky. So in this case here with this picture, taking it from there to there, I would argue this becomes quite a bland shot because we've removed the element that we were specifically trying to capture. Same in this one. So this is one of the barns out in Wyoming. What's the key part of this image? Well, it's probably the color in the sky, right? So let's just turn on our black and white, and it's now a relatively dull picture of the barn. And the reason it's quite dull is because even though these colors here, so the brown of the barn and the gray of the mountains, it's the hue that separate these things out. So even though in the color version, these are obviously different elements. I can see the barn, I can see the mountains because they're different hues. But when I turn on black and white and we remove the hue, then we're relying on tone and we're relying on contrast. And because there's not that much of a tone difference between the barn and the background, again, do that trick. Close your eyes, look away, look back quickly. What do you see? The first thing I see is probably this bright area up here and not a lot more, because all of this tends to get lost. Now it's in the black and white conversion that we can fix this, so we can decide which bits are going to be more important and less important. But it's just a thought process that I want everyone to kind of work through, which is this picture right for black and white, or am I trying to rescue something that didn't work in color? If you want to produce a black and white image, think in black and white terms. Think tone, think contrast, think texture. Don't just use black and white, going back to my famous dig, as it were, as a get out of jail. If it screws up, it's okay. It'll look good in black and white. Don't play that game. Intend to produce in monochrome. And then there's subtle differences as well. So let's look at this one. So this one, Antelope Canyon, many of you will be familiar with many of the slot canyons out in Arizona. This shot relies on color, and I can crop it in different ways. You know, I could edit this up. You know, this is pretty much as it was. But once I take this away, it's interesting. It's got texture, it's got movement in the rock and so on, but it's quite flat. And it's because it's the color that's really grabbing our attention. The second I take that hue and saturation away, then we're into a bit of a lost art. Now, that doesn't mean that slot canyons don't work for black and white. Let's take this one. So what's the difference? Let's think about this between this one and this one. It's texture, it's tone, it's contrast. When we look into here, look at all this amazing detail when it loads up of all these rock formations. So when I convert this one to black and white, what I get is some amazing tonality that changes throughout the frame. And this is why this works for a black and white conversion, whereas this one maybe not so. This one's quite flat in contrast. It does have contrast, obviously. You know, the difference between here and here is pretty strong. But what makes this picture eye-catching, or this element of the picture eye-catching, is the color in it. So don't just convert to black and white. If the color works, use the color version. But when you have got texture and contrast and detail and tone, oh wow, that's when a black and white image really comes into its own. So you've seen on here, on all four that I've just shown you just now, all I've done is tick this black and white button. We're going to go into that in a second. But there is a very easy way of converting to black and white, which is that way, and also applying a style, which we'll cover in a second. But it's the nuances in that tool that make the picture really stand out, and that's the bit that we're going to run through today. So, first things first, let's turn off that black and white. Let's get a load of color images back up onto our screen, and let's start with this shot. This was... where was this? Somewhere out in Utah, I think? No, maybe Arizona. One of those two. It's out one of the national parks somewhere. It gets confusing after a while. So, a hoodoo style of rock. So we've got red rock in here, really rich, deep red rock, lots and lots of texture. And we've got a sky up here, which is predominantly blue, little bits of white because we've got the clouds moving. This was a frame average shot. So even though each shot was a 500th of a second, it was taken over, let's have a little look, just double check, taken over 7 minutes. So it's a 7 minute long exposure. And what we've got as a result of that exposure is a massive, complete and utter separation of the foreground, which is nice and sharp and textured, and the background, sky, which has been really washed out and so on. So what we're talking about, even though there is an obvious change here in colour, so yes, the colour image works. We've got a blue, deep blue background, and we've got a red and yellow bright foreground. In black and white terms, what we've also got is a huge difference in textures, in contrasts. So we've got a very, very smooth background, so the sky, and we've got a very, very detailed, craggy, rocky foreground, which is the rocks. So let's have a little look at what we can do just out of the box. So we're not going to touch anything other than just turning on the black and white tool. So this in itself actually has, just like some of the other previous ones I was showing you, removed a bit of that difference if you think about it. Because, like I just said, the difference was, yes, it was about the smoothness of the background and the brightness of the detail of the foreground. But if I compare the brightness levels, so not the color, the brightness levels, look up here in the sky and look at this little readout up here. So we've got our red, green and blue values, very interesting, but when we convert it to black and white, they get removed. So we're left with our brightness, or our luminosity, which is, at this case, 75, 76. So between 70 and 105, somewhere in that range. So what about our rocks? Well, these ones are a little bit brighter here, but they're sort of around the hundreds or so. This here, 169, one here, 115, 130. Down here, we're getting sort of 120s. So between these differences, look, some of these clouds here are 130. So even though the color changes massively, when I remove the color data, what you've got to think about, all I'm left with is that luminosity. So when I tick this box, because these were very similar brightnesses in this area here and this area here, I lose the differentiation. But here's where it gets fun, and this is where the old school black and white people would know this one. But this is where something called filters would traditionally come in. So when you're shooting in black and white, for black and white film, you would buy coloured filters. And the coloured filter would go on the front of the lens, and it would block certain wavelengths of light, so certain colours. So you might put a red filter on the lens, you might put a green filter on the lens. And that's going to affect effectively the wavelengths of light that make it through to the sensor or the film in the camera. And I could cut certain wavelengths, or I could allow certain wavelengths through. So the advantage of having a scene that has a color differentiation here is that if I was using a filter in front of the camera, I could darken or lighten those areas effectively based on their color for the black and white film or sensor. Now in Capture One, and by the way, if you don't have the black and white tool, in current Capture One, you should find it under your color tab, I think. If you don't, then you're going to right click anywhere in the color tab, go to Add Tool and choose black and white. If you don't want it to sit in your color tab, you're going to put it into one of the other ones. You can have a custom tab, you can put it into the adjustments and exposure tab, wherever you want it to sit, but it probably makes sense in this one here. So if I turn on the black and white tool, what you see is this color sensitivity is set to 0 for all of the different colors. Imagine now, in front of my camera, so I've fast forwarded from the 1970s with my filters, and you still see people using black and white filters out there now. They're very, very good. It gets a very great result. But now I've got the option of effectively screwing on a combination of 6 different filters at 6 different strengths to manipulate the wavelengths coming through to my final image. Not to the sensor, obviously. This is already captured. I can't change the raw. The raw is what it is. But what I can do is say, do you know what? Anything that's blue or cyan, cut it down. Now, not too much. Again, don't want to spoil stuff. But, cyan's going to be where those clouds are. Blue is going to be the rest of the sky. So I can certainly darken down some of that sky and get some contrast here. What about reds? Well, let's just move up our reds. So we knew that the reds were from this rock here. So as I move along that red here, I can actually bring up the brightness of those rocks there. What about the rocks down here? Well, they're more, I guess, sort of yellow. So let's go into our black and white tool again here. We could darken down those yellow rocks. And we start to adjust the conversion that's happening from the raw color data through to the black and white output. Now, what you saw just now was actually something that's really annoying for me, and I don't know a perfect fix, but I'm going to show you a way that I deal with it, which is when you want to tweak these things and refer back to the original image. So we'll talk about some other stuff in a minute that you might want to do first, but in terms of how you manage these sliders, let's just reset them all for now. Let's say this is my raw image. Now what I'm going to do is right click, clone the variant. This one here, I'm going to go into black and white. Now with that done, I've got a reference here that I can keep looking at all the time. So you saw me before turning off the black and white to be able to see which bits were yellow, which bits were red, which bits are blue, and so on. Well, if I've got a variant here that I can keep my eye on, then I don't have to keep doing that. So I can keep an eye here and say, well, actually, I know that that sky is pretty much up in the cyans. I know that I want to lift up that red a little bit. I know I want to drop down the yellow. There isn't really any green in the picture, so nothing much is going to happen. Magenta, maybe a little bit in that rock, but again, not a lot. And that gets me a very different black and white conversion to, let's just clone it. And let's reset all of these. In fact, let's just do a quick reset and then re-enable. So that's with no manipulation. That's with some of our changes done. And we can manipulate this as much as we like based on the color values that are in the original raw. Just checking some of the live people comments. So, where are we, Dan? Many years ago, I was studying the zone system. We used a kind of monocle that allowed the photographer to, to view a scene in black and white. It helps see it different. Yeah, it does. It's really difficult for our eyes. And what will happen is over time, the more conversion stuff you do, or the more you shoot in black and white, the more your eye starts to train itself to look for texture and tone rather than hue, because it just gets bombarded with color, and that's all we see if we're not careful. Ian, is it possible to convert to black and white on a layer so that you can manipulate the base colors and see what effects is achieved in real time? Not so. In 15.3.1, no, it's not possible to do the actual black and white, this conversion here, this tool, on a layer it applies to the background. Now in future, mentioned this before, that may be something that can be altered. It may be something that comes along, but you don't necessarily need to do that, and I'll show you why. It's about understanding which tools are input and which tools are output. So we'll cover it in a way that you can adjust the colors, yes, but not as a layer, as it were. Where are we? Let me just check a couple of ones. I actually use, I actually use layers with the help of the magic brush, Luma Range, and color editor to manually control each main color. Yeah, making before and after easier. Yeah, in black and white terms though, so what we want to have is a reference when we're making these slider changes sort of live on our screen, which is where this really helps. Just having a variant, just store that variant in color just to keep it up in your browser at the same time. Okay. So, that said, let's just have a little look at, just thinking about Ian's point. I'm going to cover that. I'm actually going to bring that earlier because we're going to cover it because it's actually a very good point, and I want to cover it now before we get too deep into this stuff. So, Ian's question was, where are we? Is it possible to convert black and white on a layer so that you can manipulate the base colors and see what effect is achieved in real time? So you don't need to, because this black and white tool is effectively global. It doesn't matter where you put it in the edit. It's always going to have the same effect because it's doing it based on the raw data. However, it's doing it based on the raw data after it's been manipulated by the input tools. And what I mean by input tools are the tools that affect the image prior to black and white conversion. Those tools: curves and levels, white balance, and color editor. And then we're going to talk about the output tools. And the output tools being color balance, and this is where a lot of people get tripped up, and the black and white tool itself, along with split tone, which we'll cover in a second. So what do I mean by input tools and output tools? Well, let's take our black and white conversion here, and we know that all of these things, in fact, let's just reset it, enable black and white, and we're going to darken down blue a little bit. Okay. So what happens if I go to my original shot, or the underlying shot, and make the sky more blue? Well, I use one of my input tools. So in other words, white balance, color editor, curves, or levels. Those are the four that are key. And imagine on the original shot, so I'm actually just going to really confuse things here and reset it. So we're going to have one that we can edit here. So this one here, I'm going to change our shoot to be more blue. So 2889. And we're going to do the same conversion. So let's just turn on our white balance, enable black and white. And we're going to drop down that blue to the same amount. So where's my original black and white? We were minus 51. And the new black and white, I'm just going to make this smaller so you can see all four at the same time. Let's just move these around a little bit. You'll see why in a second. Okay, and this one is minus, let's make it the same, minus 51. So what's happened? Well, here is the black and white conversion of this raw file as it was out of the camera. And in that black and white conversion, as you remember, we took down blue to minus 51. So in other words, all of this pretty stuff up here in the sky that was blue or a shade of blue has become darker. If it wasn't, it would be left like that. But with the reduction, it's gone to that. In this version here, we've changed the white balance of the image. Underlying, it's one of the input changes to or input before the black and white conversion. So as a result of making the sky much more blue, as you can see, so there's our original, there's our new, huge amount more blue in there. That same minus 51 now affects a lot more of the sky, a lot more of the image, because more of it is blue. And that's the mindset that you've got to get to with, as I say, white balance, color editor, levels, and curves, because all of them change the data that the black and white tool, this one, is using. Color balance does not. Color balance changes the output, and we'll cover that in a second. But the key bit here is we can use this to our advantage. So if I don't want, let's just get rid of that conversion there. If I don't want the sky to be quite that blue, let's just reset our Kelvin. We can go to there. But what I can do, for example, in the color editor is say, well, actually this blue here, I'm going to saturate a little bit more. The reds, let's just click on this rock. So it's actually the oranges. Let's make the rocks then more red. And maybe saturate them a little more. Now what's that doing? Think about what the white balance, or sorry, what the black and white tool sees. It now sees more red, more saturated, so it's going to affect it more when I use that slider. What about these rocks down here? Let's pick on these. These are in the yellow. So let's make them, again, more saturated. Now this is going to look a bit weird, right? So as a color image, this is now pretty wrong. There's our original, there's our new. But as a black and white conversion, let's clone that variant. Now I've got some real sort of binary or polarization between these colors. So now when I go into enable black and white, let's pull down the blue. It's a lot more impactful. Let's lighten up the red. It's a lot more selective. Let's darken down the yellow. The rock is more yellow, so we can pick it up a lot easier. So by changing those input colors into the black and white tool, in other words, using the color editor, using white balance if you want to. So as we go more blue, the sky's going to, sorry, less blue, the sky's going to light up. As we go more blue, the sky's going to darken down. So we can adjust this to our heart's content. But we're using color changes to affect effectively the filters in the black and white tool that now sit on top of those changes. So when it comes to the ability to control different elements within your conversion, you have, and this is the bit that's a bit of a mind, what's the polite version? A mind-bending thing. You have to get your head around the fact that it is the color data that's affecting the black and white output. If you do not manipulate the color data at all, then the black and white output, let's just even reset our blue, is based purely on the luminosity up here of each pixel. It's literally taking grayscale. It's not doing any conversion. It's not doing any clever stuff. It is as if you removed the red, green, and blue channels and you're literally using the grayscale values of luminosity to produce the output. If you start manipulating the color underlying in the image, then you start to be able to make use of these sliders to start manipulating which bits are bright, which bits are darker. Because when it comes to the black and white output, remember, that's all we have. How bright, how dark. Those are the only options we've got within there. So where are we? Let's just check on a couple of questions. So George, when you convert an image to black and white using black and white curve in the base characteristics tool, you lose access to the color tools. Yes, that's a different thing. So when you start switching into black and white curves and base characteristics, you're effectively discarding all the color information. That's not the same as a conversion from color across the black and white. You lose access to a lot of those tools. The way around it is to not do it that way. It's to keep the color data and do it through the black and white tool, but using those sensitivity sliders instead. Where are we? Just like the color, sorry, Lee, just like the color editor has colors to select, if there was a tone selection tool that had 10 to 12 tones, the image is in black and white, that would be really nice. Yes. I guess the workaround, Lee, ish, and it is an ish workaround. In theory, I could create a filled adjustment layer. So my mask is everywhere, and I could go into the Luma range and let's just display the mask, and I could say, well, I want everything from 20 to 50 with a fall off of 20 either side. So that gets me a tonal range. I could create effectively 3 or 4 layers. So I've got, shadows, midtones, highlights, and so on. We'll talk about HDR in a minute, but it is possible to do it that way, because then with this range, for example, I could go into my adjustments here, go into my, for instance, exposure on this layer, and I could adjust just those tonal ranges. Whether that's going to work for you, I don't know, but that is one way of doing it. But yes, I like the idea of having a tonal range selector. It's not a bad call. But then you want 10 to 12, someone would want 20, someone would want 3. Yeah, problem. So that's in essence what that black and white conversion process is. If we take a color image and we take our standard base characteristics, and George just touched on that a second, but in our base characteristics here, at the moment I'm just leaving it on the auto curve. If, for example, quite a lot of people when they're doing a black and white conversion will switch to linear response because it gives smoother tones, less contrasty. That can be a good and a bad, it depends on where you go. But yes, you can absolutely pick different curves, different ICCs to get the input differently. But if you strip out all the color data as a result of using the curve, then Capture One does not have any color reference to be able to reference the black and white tool with. So that's one thing to bear in mind. How do you know you're working with an underlying color image? Well, number one, I remember it was in color. Number two, I have a color camera, so that would be a giveaway. But number three, and the most important one, I mentioned it just now. Let's go to our adjustments tab. So, output histogram. My histogram on the top of Capture One is always showing me what my output is going to be. My levels and curves give me my input histogram. So when I've done a black and white conversion, even though my histogram up here for output switches to a monotone histogram, so there is only one color. It's achromatic, so it's 0 up to, we'll talk about this, either 256 or 65,536 levels, but in histogram terms, 0 to 255. Let's stick with that. But I no longer have any output that's a color. Okay. The input retains all the color detail. And this is why it's really important when you start thinking about how these sliders work, you've really got to think about the underlying color data, even though you're now looking at it in monochrome. Now here's a fun one. This histogram up here, color balance. Remember I mentioned it's an output. As I start to switch my color balance, let's say our highlights are going to go red, our shadows are going to go blue, red or pink, let's go. Midtones, maybe we'll switch into there as well. Look at what's happening to my histogram, my output histogram. Because color, and don't do this. This is horrible. This is a version, I guess, of split toning. But let's just reset our black and white tool. So I'm going to enable black and white, and we're going to split tones. We're going to say shadows need to be there, midtones there, highlights there. And because we don't really have much in the highlights or in the shadows, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move our levels to push some of this stuff into shadows and highlights. And you see my histogram. So I have now enable black and white enabled. It's a black and white image, right? And what I'm working with is a black and white image, but Capture One through color balance has an ability to adjust the highlights, the shadows, and the midtones to have a hue. And because this is still a color image with a color curve, when I do that, you see all of my channels, my monochrome image, start to split because my shadows start to turn more blue. I get more blue appearing in the shadows independently of the highlights, which are starting to turn more red. They're independent as well. So as I break things around, sorry, let me just, this is probably not helping you because I'm doing it on the adjustment layer. Let's do it on our background. So here's my shadows. Here's my highlights. You can see now a bit clearer what's going on. So I now have a split out histogram. So I've done my black and white conversion. All of my input was taken by the black and white tool, this one here, and it's made the image monochrome. And then I've gone into the color balance tool and I've split out the tones. And I've said my shadows I want blue, my midtones I want greeny yellow, and my highlights I want reddy pink. And that's what it's delivering for me on the screen. Don't adjust your set. It's horrible. It's meant to be horrible. It's just to demonstrate a point. But let's just make this a bit more even obvious. Let's go to there. Okay. Look at what it's done to the output histogram, not the input histogram. This here is your input histogram. No matter what I do to those sliders, this raw data is still the raw data. As I move my levels across here, it doesn't make a difference. It does to the curve, but look at the levels here. The raw data stays where it is because it's based on what came out of the camera. But my output histogram is moving, and it's moving to split out and say, right, highlights, you need to be more red. Shadows, you need to be more blue. Midtones, you need to be more green. And that's because it was done in this tool here, color balance, which affects the output, not the input. So a lot of people get confused because they'll make a color balance change and then try to use that change and think, I've made all my shadows dark blue. So why is the black and white tool not having any effect on that? Because this tool goes back to your raw data. And then the color balance tool comes along and then makes the shadows blue. So think about it in these terms. Black and white tool and color balance tool affect what comes out. Color editor, white balance, levels and curves affect what go in. And you have to have that clear in your mind, because if you start adjusting one thinking it's going to affect the output, or adjusting another thinking it's going to affect the input, you can get very tied up very quickly. I've done it many times because I forget. The color balance is the one that really blows your mind a little bit if you forget it. But look at the difference when I shift even just highlights on its own. All of a sudden, because we've shifted the hues coming out of this picture, all of a sudden my monochrome histogram splits out again, because I've now got a color output. This histogram matches what's coming out of Capture One. This histogram matches what came in. And with a color camera, this is your color input raw, which I can convert to a black and white monochrome or achromatic output here on the histogram, as long as I don't play with the output sliders. Those output sliders, color balance, talked about it, but also you'll find it in here in split tones. Now split tones is basically another version of color balance, but very simply within the black and white tool, because a lot of people like doing this, I don't know, maybe you want the shadows to be a little bit cooler, sorry, the highlights to be a little bit cooler, and the shadows maybe a little bit warmer, and then we get into the sort of, I don't know, slightly platinum-y, or I don't know, what's it used to be called? Or polyplan or something like that. Anyway, different output formats, different printers could use different chemicals. But again, you see my split tones within the black and white tool. So even within the tool itself, the second I start playing with split tones, my output histogram is no longer black and white. My output histogram is now a color histogram. So let's just reset these and get our monochrome histogram back. That's the really important part that you really need to get really clear in your heads, which is that black and white tool is sort of 3/4 of the way along the process. Everything you do with color up until that point is going to affect what these sliders are capable of affecting themselves. After that, you've got split tone and color balance, which can tweak the output, but then you're going from black and white into the color world. Of course, the achromatic tools, things like exposure, contrast, brightness, not saturation, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, where they're just adjusting brightness of tone or luminosity, they do not have any impact on the color that the black and white tool is using to do a conversion. What does have an impact, which might surprise people, is if I change curve, and we're going to pick on an image in a second just to demonstrate this. If I change luma curve, I'm just changing the brightness values, yeah? If I change RGB curve, then it can have the effect of changing the perceived saturation of a color. Because, for instance, if I pull this curve up here, well, that's going to affect this red and green volume of color, let's call it that, a lot more than the blue volume of color. So as a result, it's going to lift up the red and greens more proportionately than the blues that were sat down here in the shadows. So as a result of manipulating the RGB curve, when I go on to my black and white conversion tool, that blue change might be less impactful because I've lifted up the blues and I've also made the reds and greens in this shadow even brighter by a bigger amount. Proportionately, there's more of them there to push up. So if you're going to really focus on black and white, true black and white, monochrome work, consider forgetting that the RGB curve exists. Do your color switching in the color editor, whether it's advanced or basic, doesn't make a difference, and do any curve work in the luma version of the curve, because that's just going to change brightness values. It's not going to affect saturation of color. It's not going to affect the split out red, green and blue channels. So you're not going to affect the impact of that changing curve when it comes to your sensitivity sliders here. I'm hoping that makes sense. If that does not make sense to people, you might need to replay this maybe a time or two. Let me know, because it is complex when you start thinking about what are the changes on the way in before I get to these sliders. And if you think about it, any tool that starts affecting color will impact what these sliders do. And all of these other tools, so the levels tool at an RGB level can affect slightly the colors, not quite so much. But the curve here really can. If you get this wrong, it can really affect things. Try and stick to that luma curve if you can, if you want to play pure black and white all the time. So that's our inputs. Those are our outputs. Let's look at the easiest possible way of doing a black and white conversion. Let's pick on, let's go to this shot here. So this is a, what is it? Snake River out in the Teton Mountains. So here's a quick little hint. If you don't own a Phase 1 camera, you can still apply a Phase 1 style. Go to the styles and presets, go to built-in styles, go to IQ styles. IQ is the digital backs that we use on Phase 1. And there are two black and white built-in styles that actually affect the underlying image. It's great. One is called black and white contrast. One is called black and white neutral. Black and white contrast, as you can imagine, here's the evidence on the screen, makes it quite contrasty. So if you have an image which has already got a lot of contrast in it, and we'll look at that in a second, it can push maybe the shadows too far, the highlights too far. You can end up in a sticky place. Black and white neutral, a more muted effect. So it's got less impact than contrast, and probably better in this particular scene to not push things too far. But let's just pick on both of them at the same time. So there, let's go to black and white contrast. Again, like I mentioned earlier, on these styles, Oops, let's just reapply. And this one neutral, I don't have the option to apply to a new layer or selected layer. The reason is because at the moment the black and white tool, the conversion tool, has to sit effectively on the background, or more accurately, it's global. It affects the whole image, so you can't just put it on a layer and then back it away. So it's apply to background. So there's our contrast one. There's our neutral one. Now these are styles that are designed by the Phase 1 guys out in Copenhagen to emulate the Phase 1 digital backs producing black and white images. And when it comes to this sort of image here, I tend to find they start from a pretty good place. And let's just, again, clone that variant. I'm going to turn off this style. And this time I'm just going to go without any changes. So no input changes, output changes, or whatever else. Enable black and white. So Phase 1 contrast, Phase 1 neutral, enable black and white. You'll notice pretty similar, right? Probably, you could argue, almost the same. I would argue it is the same. But if ever you just want to make a change to quickly get you to a monochrome version, and go into that styles tab, and just using one of the 2IQ styles will get you there yourself. What you actually find is, if you've used the black and white neutral one, when you go to the color tab, you'll find enable black and white is on there, and it's already pretty much done. Let's just go on to there. So it's already applied a neutral looking, and then you can go from there. Neutral looking output. Where are we? Couple things on there. Thomas, might be a good idea to make an input tool tab just to remind us of which they are. Maybe. So one thing, again, great thing with Capture One, good decision using Capture One, is we can adjust our workflow, our tool completely around our workflow. So up here, I can add a new tab. So if I wanted a tab, let's do a custom tool tab, and let's think about this. So custom tool tab, black and white. Let's pick a, let's go with that one. Now on my tool tab, I might want to add, first off, histogram, because I want to keep an eye on that. And then I'm going to add on, let's say, white balance, because that's definitely going to affect things. Then I'm going to add on color editor, definitely going to affect things. Then I'm going to add on levels. Then I'm going to add on curves. And then at the bottom, I might add the actual black and white tool. So I now have every single tool that I need in that tab. Now I've put them all in the stuck bits, so they're not going to flow up and down as you would do if you were doing it properly. But you can have a black and white tab which just keeps you reminded that these are the tools that affect my black and white tool, so only use those. Don't stray into the other ones. Absolutely, you could do it that way, but you can design your workspace around you when it comes to doing this stuff. And if you do a lot of conversion, I would argue it's probably a good idea to have a dedicated tool tab that does this for the tools that are important to this one. All we're trying to do is get this tool as good an input as it can possibly have in the first place. Mark, I tend to use black and white tool, and if I need greater luminance values and I go back and change a color saturation, absolutely. Saturation or brightness, remember, so you can do it through the color editor, and we don't have to just use where are we? So color editor here, it's not just about saturation, it's also lightness, because lightness is going to affect that conversion later on as well. But yeah, absolutely, the more rich the blue is, the more affected it is by this slider here. Ian, you might want grain too. Yeah, absolutely. But, and this is where I'm going to come into it. This is my black and white input. So back to Thomas's point, if you want to keep all your inputs together prior to the black and white tool, then putting them above there, and then maybe actually from a logical point of view, well, we could put in there, oops, not filters. That would be very good for sorting out my catalog, but not for this. We could put in there film grain. And we could put in there color balance afterwards. So now if you think about it, I have a really logical flow as my own dedicated workspace for black and white. I've got my histogram, which is showing me my output. I've got white balance, color editor, levels and curves. All four of those directly affect how the black and white conversion happens. Now, of course, it's affected by exposure and contrast, and we'll cover that in a second. But those are the color ones that really affect it. After my black and white conversion, I might want to add some film grain. That's an output thing. And I might want to change my color balance if I really want to do a split tone on the way out. So building this into a workflow that makes logical sense for you is going to save you a huge amount of mind time, as it were, when it comes to hunting down the tools that are in the right order. So with our default IQ style, I mentioned before, black and white neutral versus black and white contrast start from a different position. Black and white contrast can produce some amazing results out of very flat images. So I'm just going to pick on this shot here. Let's create a new variant. So let's actually just clone that so it stays put. Let's put black and white contrast on. Now, we have a bit of a problem here because black and white contrast, what it's seen as contrast is the difference between the sky and the ground. But it has made it look more dramatic. So this is where, even though your style is called contrast, it might not be the contrast that you're looking for. So let's just pop back to here. Because when we're teaching people to move from color into black and white using these IQ styles specifically, quite often what we talk about is, what would you prefer to fix? So when it comes to, let's just reset both of these actually. Sorry, I'm just going to reset them back to complete raw because they were exposed for, this is really cool out here actually, these sun rays. But it was exposed for there. So there's a tiny little bump here of exposure and then the rest of it sits down here. In my styles tab, let's put on black and white neutral, black and white contrast. Now you can see for real now, there's my neutral. We've got a bit of detail in here, but it started off pretty dark already, right? Here's my black and white contrast. I've lost all detail down here. Look at these numbers up here at the top. You know, it's not quite 0, but it may as well be. I mean, it's 4, 5, stuff like that. So this conversion doesn't necessarily mean you only deal with those color tabs, those input tabs. It doesn't stop you using your exposure tabs, your high dynamic range, your clarity, your adjustments. And when we talk to people about using the difference between the IQ's black and white contrast versus the IQ black and white neutral, what we talk about is, in contrast, you might have to rescue some highlights. You might have to rescue some shadows, but you're going to have some built-in contrast to begin with. In black and white neutral, you may have to add some contrast because everything has been protected. You've got your tone saved, but in the middle, it can be quite mushy. So you've got to decide which end you want to come from. If you're starting from a high contrast color image, maybe consider using black and white neutral as your starting point and then building up contrast from there so you haven't pushed anything too far. Likewise, if you're starting from a very flat image, use black and white contrast to build the contrast first, and then you can work out if you need to rescue anything if it's pushed it too far. So if we start from, let's start from neutral here. So this is the built-in style into black and white, taking it flat as it was out of the Capture One or out of the Phase 1 style pack. I'm going to go on to, well, what is normally my adjustments tab in color terms, but now we're just focusing on these. So I'm going to look at bringing up my shadows. Pretty good. Maybe I rescue those whites because they were a little bit risk of clipping there. Blacks is going to focus on just these darkest parts of the histogram. So let's go there. And remember, here's a fun one. Black and white, they're actually kind of the wrong word, but they're the best way of describing it. In a color image, black does not mean black. Black means the lowest values of the 3 colors. So if you've got a red, green, and blue channel, and they're all, let's say they're a value of 5 in brightness, black lifts them up. The reason it's called black is it typically looks like a black shadow in a picture. But if that picture had nothing other than red in it, so there's no green, no blue, the black slider would pick up the darkest reds. Same with white. So the white slider is not necessarily picking up white. It's picking up the brightest parts. It's not looking for matching pixels in RGB terms. It's picking the brightest values of the red, green, and blue and pulling them down or pushing them further. So in this case here, even though it doesn't, so for the first time after a conversion, these sliders actually do mean what they're supposed to mean. It is the whitest parts of the image and the blackest parts of the image with no color information. But just bear in mind that those sliders in a color image don't actually mean literal black and literal white. They mean the darkest parts of the histogram and the brightest parts of the histogram. So we can pull up our shadow a little more. We could even afford to push up our exposure a touch. Now, if we're worried about the really bright parts here, clipping, don't use exposure, use brightness. And then we get into a pretty good conversion. If I go before and after, you know, there to there. If I wanted this in black and white, I don't, because I like the color in it. But if I did, that's a better place to be than this original one starting from that style. So just bear in mind those two styles. They are very quick ways of getting to a black and white image, but just be careful that you're not using them just because it's a one click, because you really need to, once you have applied it, still go in, still make your changes, still make your contrast differences, your exposure. You might want to use some clarity. So again, not too much, don't push it like that. But, you know, you can get away with easily sort of 30 in a sort of mountain scene, maybe a bit of structure in there. All of these tools still work just as well when it comes to a black and white conversion as they do in color. Now, let's have a look at using an external editor. So some fun. We can use, so there's a tool that we're going to run through in a second called Silver Efex. It comes from DxO Labs. Used to be Google bought it. That was from Nick originally, Nick Software. So this tool is a fantastic tool. Lots of people use it, but it's been disowned by many companies over the years. It seems to have found a home with DxO for now. So it's part of the Color Efex suite, I think. So the version that we're using at the moment is the suite version, I think is 5. And it's Silver Efex Pro 3. Now, you can take a color image or a black and white image. Oh, sorry, one question. Rick, does dehaze affect input or output? It affects input. Sorry, I didn't cover that one. So yes, the other ones down here, so clarity and dehaze, do affect input into the black and white tool. And actually, look at that difference. That's interesting. Didn't see that before. By cutting the haze, which it's picked up as this slightly bluey color in the original, which would sort of make sense because there is a sort of a haze up here, and it's picked that up from there. By cutting that haze, let's just go into here. So without, with, a lot more detail on the grass, a lot more texture. So yes, use the dehaze tool, but it does affect the input into the black and white conversion tool. It's not an output one. Most tools are input. It's pretty much the black and white. Vignetting is a global. Film grain and color balance will affect the output into whatever file you're producing. And we'll talk about ICCs in a second. So Silver Efex. You can take a color image or you can take a black and white image out of Capture One. In this case, let's take this black and white just because we've already done some editing on it. Now, for those of you that are struggling with integrating something like a plugin like Silver Efex into Capture One, there are a couple of things to check. The first is your preferences. So under preferences in Capture One, under plugins, you will find a thing called Open With menu. This is built into Capture One. Any software you install onto your computer will have the ability to appear, if it's relevant, in the Open With tool. And what we're going to make sure of is that we have, where are we? Sharpener Silver Efex Pro 3 enabled. So when you install the Nick collection, or I think it's still called Nick collection, when you install it, you've got all these different tools, so Color Efex, Viveza, other stuff, but you've also then got Silver Efex Pro 3. Put the tick in that box, and what that means is, I'm going to hide my viewer for a second. When I right click on here, and I've got some options here, and I'm going to talk about them in a second, but under my list here, I see in there Silver Efex Pro 3. If I haven't enabled it in the Open With box, I won't have the ability, or the Edit With box, I won't have the ability to do it like that. And then weirdly, it disappeared out of my Open With, but that's a bit of a, it was there earlier. So let's just make sure it's definitely on there. Okay, it was before. We'll deal with that in a second. Right, before we go into that, menus. When you're in Capture One and you go to export something, that means it's going to take a snapshot of the variant you've created, the actual picture that you've created, as an output. So forget the raw, because that's how. So if you want to do that with the raw, you need to export originals, it's called. But if you export a variant or go to the export tab or tool, it's going to take a snapshot of everything you've done, what we refer to as bake it in. So in other words, once it's made into a cake, no, you can't get the eggs back out. It's that simple. It bakes it into that variant and it saves it externally. And that's it. That's the last that Capture One knew about it. It sends it somewhere else. Edit with takes the variant with all the changes that you've made, it bakes them in, and it sends it across to a third-party editor, which could be, in this case, Silver Efex, but it could be Photoshop, could be Affinity, could be Helicon Focus, could be, I don't know, one of the panoramic things if you didn't want to use the Capture One. Any of those tools, and it takes that file, hands it to that application, and waits. And the reason it's waiting is because when you save it in that application, it's saved back into your catalog or into your session. So it's saved back, and it will appear in your catalog if you're using a catalog as a file, normally as a TIFF file. Open with. Imagine I've got one of those TIFF files. Well, I don't want to create another TIFF file, so think about it. If I come back to Capture One tomorrow and I go from this picture to a TIFF file and I want to continue working with that TIFF file, I don't want to edit with, because what's edit with going to do? It's going to create it's going to take a snapshot, it's going to create a new file, pass it to a third-party editor, and then save it down again. So I end up with two TIFF files. So if I want to work on the existing file that's already been outputted or exported, I use open with, not edit with. And this is going to be important in a second because it will then update the TIFF file, the same TIFF file that you originally edited. So the reason that's important. Let's take this picture, right click, edit with Silver Efex Pro 3. And I'm going to tell it I want a TIFF file, I want it 16-bit. We're going to talk about this in a second because this is fun, but I'm going to leave it for now as Adobe RGB 1998. And we're going to go to edit variant. Now what's this going to do? You can see up here it's processing. It's created a TIFF file, added it to the catalog, and look at that, it's loaded up Silver Efex. Now Silver Efex, as we said, different application, completely different application to Capture One, made by a different company, but very well known for really, really good black and white conversions. You've got presets that are built in, so where are we? Intensifier. Some of the structure ones are really, really good. So if we go to all, there's 64 built in. If we go to, where are we? High structure, but smooth, you can get a really nice conversion there. You've got all these adjustments in here, all these brightness adjustments and so on. You've also got the ability, strangely, we were talking about it earlier, to apply a filter like you used to be able to. So we can apply a green filter that will have a material effect on a color image. We've taken a black and white image, so bear in mind it's not going to have an effect on here. But if you send a color image into Silver Efex, this is basically replicating what the Capture One color sensitivity sliders are doing in a black and white conversion. So there are two ways of working with Silver Efex and two ways of saving with Silver Efex, and they're very important. Ways of working. You can send it a black and white image, and it will do a really good job with all of these different presets of applying things like film grain, applying looks from different cameras and so on. Great. Or, let's cancel that. Here, let's just reset this picture. Right click, edit with, Silver Efex. Same deal, export a TIFF, 16-bit, all good. Now look at this TIFF at the moment. It was black and white. You saw it there quickly, a little preview. Sorry, it was color. You saw it with the preview. Silver Efex takes the color image and does everything that you could do in Capture One, and arguably a little bit more in some cases, to the color that's underlying it. So let's go to exactly where I was before so you can see it. So high structure, smooth. Let's bring up the shadows. Let's even bring up the midtones. I love there's a midtone slider in here. We can put up some dynamic brightness if we want to. We can, all these different tools, but here's the fun one. Because I exported a color image to Silver Efex, Now all of a sudden my filters start working. So if I go to my blue filter, I can start changing the impact of that color being cut or amplified in the final shot. So passing Silver Efex color information means that all of a sudden these sliders, so green for our grass, let's just pull that up a little bit. Is that having maybe the grass wasn't green enough in there. Oh, I don't know. But all of a sudden my sliders come alive because I've passed it color information, and Silver Efex is now playing with the color underlying. So imagine everything in Capture One was an input. Everything here is now choosing to be an output. Makes sense. So those are the two modes. You can send Silver Efex a black and white shot. Already done your conversion in Capture One, you want to make some tweaks, do it that way. Or if you want to start completely from fresh in Silver Efex from the color base shot, don't do your black and white conversion in Capture One. Right click on the color version, edit with Silver Efex, and go into here. So those are the two modes you can work in. Then we've got the two ways of saving, and this is actually really, really powerful within Silver Efex. So people complain that some of these plugins aren't necessarily integrated in the way they want into Capture One. I disagree. You saw in Capture One I saved out a TIFF file. Now, as we know, TIFF files have things baked in. So I'm going to make some changes here and say brightness all the way up. So don't do this. Brightness all the way up. Rescue the highlights. Bring the midtones where they were. Let's whack up some contrast. Okay. And I'm going to apply that. Cool. So this then processes, big image, 150 megapixel file, 16-bit TIFF. It's not going to be particularly quick. And it's going to save that TIFF. That's the most important bit. The actual TIFF file. I'm just looking at my file system over here to make sure it's appearing. So this was, I think, 1229 space 1. So this one down here. There it is. There's my black and white conversion from Silver Efex. And then I think, but I wanted to make some change. I made one mistake in there. Well, we know that we don't necessarily, I'm just going to move these next to there. We don't necessarily need to worry about editing it again because we've got our open with. So open with, there we go, Silver Efex. So it's not creating a new variant. It's the same TIFF. But, oh no, all my sliders have reset. Why? Because it baked it into the TIFF. So my changes I made in Silver Efex, the second I hit this apply button, let me just pull it so you can see it. Oh no, it's behind me. Where are we? There it is, apply. The second I hit apply, that's the cooking show. It's baked it in. We now have a cake. I want my eggs back. Can't have it. You got a cake. So instead, color version, right click, edit with Silver Efex. Choose all your settings that you want. It's going to load up Silver Efex just like before. There we go. And I'm going to, let's pull down some highlights, some midtones, some shadows, dynamic brightness, overall brightness down. I'm just making a point, so soft contrast. Maybe we drop that back. A lot of structure. Okay, cool. Right. Now I'm going to tick a very special box. Non-destructive edit. Click that box. Hit apply. It's going to do the same process. You'll see in Capture One, it's going to create me a space 2 file because my export added another suffix. So when it's finished processing, and I'm going to give you some numbers here, just so you don't you don't fall into the trap that a lot of people have. So that's going to appear down here. It started out in color. There we go. There's our processed version. So there's number 2. So we've now got our number 1, which was just an output into Silver Efex from black and white. This one, our underscore space 1, is the one that's baked in to Silver Efex. If I open it again in Silver Efex, I start from 0. I've got no idea of the adjustments that I made. And this one, space 2, which is the one where I tick that little box saying non-destructive. And if I now go into open with Silver Efex, all my sliders are there. And it's remembered all of the changes that I made. So this combination between Capture One and Silver Efex with this button ticked is really powerful. You can choose to do all of your conversion in Capture One. You can choose to do some of it. Maybe your color changes, maybe your HDR rescuing, maybe, you know, some of the white balance changes and stuff like that. Do that in Capture One. Hand it across to Silver Efex. Do your other changes, the micro adjustments, the film grain adding, the vignetting, the structure. Tick this box and you can always go back to it, even though it's a TIFF, with the adjustments and make tweaks to it later. It is so powerful if you just tick that box. Downside, let me just double check. Our original TIFF file was 908 meg. The version that is editable is 1.8 gig. Now, my TIFF files are huge to start with. That's a single layer TIFF file from 150 meg image at 16-bit. Obviously, it's going to be big. But ticking that box is going to double the size of your TIFF file. So just bear that in mind. Don't fall into the trap of just always ticking the box and just filling up your drive. But if you can, you've now got a non-destructive RAW editor in Capture One and a non-destructive tool, plugin, filter, whatever you want to call it, in Silver Efex by just ticking that box that you can go back to. So what I would end up with personally is I wouldn't have that one, wouldn't have that one, probably wouldn't have that one. So I've got my original one here that I created my variant from and my exported one in Silver Efex. And if I want to make changes later in Silver Efex, when I go to open with, it's going to, and all those changes are sat there waiting for me to edit. They're not baked in. It's actually got that non-destructive layer over the top that allows me to play again. And that's so cool. Couldn't do that many years ago. Can do now. It's really, really useful. Right. So that said, that's our, so starting, as it were, with conversion in Capture One, conversion in Silver Efex. You can choose how much you want to do in Capture One, how far you want to get, how far you want to take it from in Silver Efex, but do tick that box if you're going to use Silver Efex to make it non-destructive. Now, let's go back to our sad and depressing dark waterfall. So even though I've ticked black and white contrast as an IQ style, I want it to be boosted and contrasty. Why is it not? What's gone wrong? Well, let's look at, and the key is our histogram. So in the color version, you've got a load of data sat in here, a little bit of data sat up here, and then a bit up here in the brightness. So as I move my mouse around, for some reason my readouts are disappeared. That's a bit annoying, isn't it? Yeah. Very strange. They're there, and now they're not. Okay, so normally I'd be showing you my readouts along here and we'd be able to have a look at what's going on, but for some reason it doesn't want to play with this one. It does in the black and white version, strangely. It's very odd. Right, as I'm moving my mouse around, you can see all of this lot sits here in the shadows. Look at this little orange bar moving around, all of it. The water still sits in the shadows, no different. It's only the sky that sits up here in the highlights. So using the IQ contrast black and white style, all it's doing is it's pushing the brights brighter and the darks darker. All of this sits in the dark. So it's not surprising that it's made it less contrasty. So there are a couple of things that we can do. Number one, let's create a clone of this variant. Let's think about the colors that are here. So we've got greens in here. We can see that. You know, we've got some blues up here in the sky. So let's go to our inputs. On here, now we could play with white balance. We could make this more blue, so that's going to be picked up just like the sky, but I'm going to probably darken down the sky a little bit. We could separate it some more, so I've got more green and yellow. Maybe that's going to help me for sure. So now in my color editor, I can click on this mountain here and we can make that saturation a bit bolder. We can make it maybe a bit darker. This one here, which is in this blue area, well, we're going to make that lighter for a start, saturation up and so on. So I'm making a color image look pretty bad. And the reason is because I'm trying to separate out those color values so that when I tick on my enable black and white, I've now got the ability. Remember I made that waterfall that fell in the blues. I made it a bit more light and a bit more saturated and whatever. We've now got independent control of the water, whereas we didn't before. Now up here in the sky, well, that's not really one that we need to worry about with brightness, or sorry, with color. We can just do that with the standard brightness and HDR tools. So let's go to our high dynamic range, pull our highlights down. This still isn't a highlight. We've lifted it up, but it's not a highlight. We pull our whites down, so we get back to seeing some texture up here with this cloud. Look, there's some cloud stuff up here that we didn't see before. We could pull our shadows up a little bit, but bear in mind the shadows also affect this as much as they do the rock. So maybe we want to pull our rocks down a little bit. So black, remember I mentioned about the black slider? It's just the darkest parts of the histogram. Still not too happy though. So look, our water is sat here, right about there in the histogram. So it's about the sort of, you can see on the numbers at the top, 60 to 70, something like that. The sky is in the 180s, so that's separate to the water. Down here we've got sort of 20, 30s, 40s. Here, 10s to 20s. So I know I can pick out sort of, I guess, 50 to 70 range. It's purely going to be this waterfall. So, like I said earlier, not everything in a black and white conversion needs to be down to those color filters. Stick with the tools that we already have. My Luma curve. So I'm going to pick on, I'm going to lock in, let's say anything less than 50. So my input and output is 50 there. And anything more than around about, I don't know. In fact, let's go higher. About 150, don't touch. This bit in the middle, let's lift that up. Let's lift up our midtones. Our preview isn't updating very correctly, which is a bit odd, but not sure why. Because it should be. Let's just have a little look. Pull that up and make sure our shadows stay where they are. Yeah, that sort of works. So we're in a place where, as a curve, so forgetting color data, forgetting all of the filter stuff down here in our black and white tool, as a curve, it can sometimes still be the most effective way of affecting a change on an area. If I temporarily undo, so that's before, that's after, again, before, after, I've now got contrast back in a black and white conversion. But the contrast came from the middle, the mid-tones, which is why we've got this hump here, because that's where the waterfall sat. Don't want to affect the sky too much, don't want to affect the rocks too much, just want to pick on that waterfall. And then again, if this still isn't quite, I guess, compelling enough, whatever we want to use, we can still use our levels to really push it. Just be careful with that bright sky. So again, think, well, I've got a tool for that. I've got my highlight and my white tool that can recover that sky back. I could even, if I really wanted to, pull down the very, very brightest parts of our curve to protect the sky as well a little bit. But that's a pretty nice conversion there from what was there. And actually, when I go into here and look at all this detail, really, really nice water strands, looks really cool. But we've used other tools outside of the actual black and white tool to be able to affect that contrast. And that's the important part here. This here was actually quite dull. Let's just make you see the difference. Here is our standard black and white conversion. All of these tones are very, very similar. That's a problem. So use the other tools around you as well. It does exactly the same thing as it does in color in black and white, but look at how much difference that brings from the standard black and white conversion from color, where it's just taking tone. Here we have adapted some of that color so that those color filters, especially the blue, has lifted it, but that's not enough. Look, I'm at 100 out of that water already. It needed more. And when it needs more, that's where levels, curves, HDR tools, clarity, all of that stuff starts to come into its own. And you can make something look really cool starting from what is actually quite a stable mid-toned image with very little contrast. Rick, where are you? Can you do HDR sliders in a separate layer and mask out part of the image? Yes, absolutely. Yes, you can. So if I wanted, in fact, let's do clarity as an example. So this conversion makes no difference. So let's create a new empty adjustment layer. Let's go, in fact, let's use Magic Brush. Joe's just said about style brush and the waterfall and work curves from there. Exactly the same. Yep, you could. The fact for me is I also want to make sure that we're adjusting the stuff around it so it doesn't look quite so isolated. But yeah, we can use a style brush, we can use Magic Brush. Let's just do that a second here. So I'm going to say, sorry, I didn't mean to click that. So make sure you've got sample entire photo off with a relatively small tolerance on it. Let's just do that, and let's just add a bit to that waterfall. So we're getting all of this. Debate point whether you want to include the spray on the right, that's up to you, but I can now completely add in clarity water. So our layers work exactly the same, and now I've got the ability to turn that off, on, boost it more, boost it less. Completely up to you. But yeah, a style brush would also work in the same way, Joe. How you brush it, whether it's magic brush or normal brush, up to you. But that's the stuff that when you look at a black and white image, and go back to that very first thing that I said, back up here, what are we drawn to? So in a black and white image here, we're seeing shape first. And in here, what shape do I see? This, up the top. Oh, sorry, you need to be able to see what I'm talking about. In here, what shape do I see? This at the top. That's not an interesting shape. When I add this T into it as a waterfall, that's interesting. And that's what I need in that black and white image, because I'm going from shape to tonality to texture, and then we'll talk about grade in a second as well. Okay, so let's go on to grain, then we'll go on to ICCs quickly too. Grain. So, like I said earlier, it depends on where you fall in the camp of black and white historians, as it were, but typically black and white film would come with a little bit of nostalgic grain with it. So there is a function in Capture One to add some grain. It also exists in Silver Efex, so you can do it in the Silver Efex plugin too. Remember that plugin, right click the open with or the edit with. If it doesn't appear there after you've installed it, go to preferences and make sure it's enabled in there in that menu. So here's our black and white image. If I want to add some grain, here is our film grain. Be careful with impact. I would implore everyone to do grain at 100%. Do not try and do film grain out here. The previews are simply not good enough to be able to see the detail in the grain. Do it at 100% or more. What looks like now still a clean image, if I were to undo it, you'll see that's a lot cleaner in this texture here. Just turn it back on again. And you can see there's tiny little dots. I don't know whether you can quite see it when we broadcast out, but you should be able to see it now. Let's maybe we come out a little bit. Let's go to 400%. Okay. So that's with film grain on. That's with film grain off. On, off. But fine grain. There are different types of grain. So we can go to harsh grain if we want to, and wow, that's pretty rough. Now, if you look at some of the Icelandic films and look at some of those, you know, the fashionable posts that show people against these old backgrounds, and it looks like it was taken in the 1930s, they've whacked on a load of grain. Now, your choice. You can do that, you can not do that. It's entirely up to you, but the function is in there. It's in your film grain tab. If that doesn't exist, so it's under the details or the refined tab as it is now in 15.3. It's in there. If you don't have it or you want to add it to your special black and white tab, remember, right click, add tool, and you'll see it in there as film grain. So your choice. Where I said earlier about the problem with grain in color terms, when I go to the color image and add that same grain, so let's go to harsh grain, I think it was sort of around 50-ish, where this looks a bit nostalgic, this just looks like it was shot at ISO 2 billion. So I'd be careful with grain when it comes to color images, but in black and white images, it can work for a certain style. Okay, so final little bit, outputting, especially for black and white. Now, we talked about earlier about the bit depth, or I mentioned bit depth a little earlier. All of these images here that I've captured, we are editing in a raw color space, as it were, or whatever. We don't actually choose a bit depth until we export out of Capture One. Now, depending on your camera can either record 8-bit, quite normal, 10-bit images. Yeah, more and more of those are getting there. 12-bit maybe. Phase 1 will record 16-bit images. Now, what's the difference? What does that mean? It means that for every channel in red, green, or blue in a color basis, at 8-bit, it's recording 256 levels. At 16-bit, it's recording 65,536 levels. So if I discard my color data and go to purely 8-bit, which is, interestingly, just bear in mind, what most printers use. So most printers still output in 8-bit, even monochrome ones. There are some that do more, but just bear that in mind. When you're outputting 256 shades of grey. It's more than 50. That was too easy. But you can see it. You can see it in gradients in skies. 65,000 levels of grey. Maybe you don't. Bear in mind the printer is going to maybe make some adjustments and lower that down to 8-bit later on. But in the same way as colour, I would not consider exporting anything less than 16-bit unless you have to. Now, when you go to export, just one question before we go much further. So, Alan, what if in order to do sharpening just an output? Personally, and this is personal preference, it's nothing to do with the best practice. I do most of my sharpening because we print relatively big. I do most of my sharpening at 100%. Let's just turn this grain off. At 100%, viewing the picture itself. I'm not using output sharpening to do it. So I would be in here and I would be using that until such point that I don't have any halos, but I've got all my detail because we're printing typically at a large enough size. If you're printing at very different sizes and very varying dimensions, then we'll cover it in a second. But yes, you can do it in the export tab, but just bear in mind, I don't personally. I do it in here at 100% and then rely on that. So when I go to export, ignore the fact this says JPEG. I'm going to call it playing because it's not a JPEG. I'm going to export this as a TIFF, 16-bit, uncompressed. Here's the interesting one, ICC profile, Adobe RGB. So let's export this image. It's a black and white image, but it's going to export as Adobe RGB. In terms of your question, Alan, in terms of adjustments, you'll see on there I've got no output sharpening. You can, of course, choose for screen or print depending on how big it's going to go. So, you know, depending on your output inches and then how many PPI and how well the distance is going to be from where you're looking, you can set it to do it automatically. Personally, I prefer to keep control. So 16-bit Adobe RGB 1998 export. Let's export that image. And I'm also going to export the same image, but instead of that, let's go to phase 1 gray G22. Now, there are many different grayscale ICC profiles. If you have a black and white printer, you can get the ICC profile for that printer. If you send it to a black and white specialist, they will have an ICC profile for your specialist. And let's export this image as well. I'm just going to call it Masterclass P1, just so I remember. So in my folder that you guys can't see, is off on the other screen, I have got my Masterclass TIFF. And that TIFF file, just load it into Photoshop, is a black and white TIFF. Yeah, great. Only it's not. Look at the menu. It's an RGB. So even though it is black and white, there's no data in there in terms of color data. It's all mono data. It is not actually a black and white TIFF. It's actually a 3-color channel TIFF with red, green, and blue channels. It just happens that those red, green, and blue channels are identical. If I export that phase 1 version or any other ICC profile that's a black and white monotone, you will see up here it says gray. It doesn't say RGB. And if I were to go to the image menu under mode, you will see it says grayscale with a bit depth. This version here, the RGB one, image mode, it's RGB color. Now, you're not losing anything by exporting as RGB, a monochrome image. You can see these two images. They are basically the same, except for obviously if the ICC had a particular calibration in it to make it look different. But you'll see in here in my gray image, I've got 1 channel, gray. On my RGB image, I've got 3 channels, red, green, and blue, which are all identical because they all have the same data, which forms the RGB. The difference, the big difference, this file, 908 meg. This file, 303 meg. It's interesting, roughly 3 times the size. Why? Because it's got 3 times as many channels in this one. And you don't need all 3 of them. You only need the one. You only need the gray. So if you're trying to save size and space and storage and whatever on your system, consider when you go to export your black and white image, in Capture One on your export tab, you are more than welcome, instead of using an ICC profile of color, of all the different wonderful color ones there are, You can choose a phase 1 grey, or you can choose an Adobe grey, or you can choose the grey scale from your printer that you've been given, or you've downloaded, or you've created yourself. Doesn't matter. But if you save it as a grey file, you will save yourself 2/3 of the space that's completely unnecessary, because it's going to be discarded anyway. Right. I think, looking through my little checklist, I think we're pretty much done on black and white conversions. Interesting one, for those of you that like numbers. An 8-bit image means that the red has 256 levels, green 256 levels, blue 256 levels. In a color image, that means that you've got a total number of colors or tones of 16.7 million. Many people know that one. That's the magic number, 16.7 million. If you're shooting in 16-bit, it means each channel, red, green, and blue, has 65,536 levels from black to white, which means you are capable of recording 281 trillion tones. Pretty sure the human eye can't see those or decipher between them, but that's what we're talking about. When we talk about bit depth, that's why the 16-bit versus 8-bit thing is so sensitive for people. The challenge is that for all that good stuff you've done at 16-bit, when you go to most printers, they're going to dumb it down to 8-bit anyway. But my argument would be, why would you save it as 8-bit now? Because who knows, in 10 years' time, you might be able to get more out of it. We don't know. So a couple of questions before we finish. I think I covered Alan's one. Alan Clark. So the cyan slider is useful for adding blue tone in addition to the blue slider. Absolutely, yes. If you are in a sky situation up here, so let's just turn on our black and white. Yes, I can darken down the blue, but actually those clouds, look, they sat in the cyan area as well. So don't just use blue on its own. Oops, sorry, you can't see my tool because of Alan's comment. Don't use blue on its own. Use it along with cyan if you've got a sky where it looks sort of like that. Same in this one. It was quite a bluish cyany sort of sky. So by pulling those down, we can add a lot of separation between the subject and the sky. Cyan and blue together, great. Rick, if you've already done sharpening in the refine tab and then leave it to export on output, there'll be cumulative and risk over sharpening. Yes. And that's the one to be careful of. So do it carefully. And it's why maybe it's inefficient, but I always prefer to control my sharpening by visual. And I like to see at 100% what it's doing and then take it all from there. So that's a lot for black and white conversions. Remember, this is about conversion rather than necessarily shooting in black and white, but some of the same stuff applies. You know, this stuff around sensitivity and filters applies when you're capturing in black and white as well. But those key things, so number one, just think in your head when you are shooting for black and white or considering a conversion, you're removing hue and saturation, you're removing all the color, texture and everything, and you're going straight for tonality, detail, texture. That's what makes a black and white image stand out. So don't just think, I'll just take the color one and whack it into black and white to rescue it. Think about how to get the best out of it. So with that done, that's probably us for today. Didn't actually show that image, but maybe we'll do that another time too. For those of you that have missed the previous ones, there are still the night cityscapes and golden hour ones in the description for this video. You will see a link to those ones if you want to catch up on it. The next one, next masterclass, is going to be on planning. So all of the apps, all of the forecasting that we use, all of the astro data that we use, and actually for all that forecasting, what actually happens when you go and stand on a hillside and it was all wrong. So we're going to cover planning, we're going to cover lens selection, we're going to cover everything from equipment through to apps and everything in between. So that's in a month's time. Again, click through on that description, it covers all of that stuff. And then in the meantime, between then and now, just give us a shout if you need anything. Put a comment in here if anything didn't make sense or you've watched this again and you want to ask a different question to what you did before. Hopefully that answers most stuff on black and white conversion. If there is anything more, then just let us know and we'll try and cover it later. Right, cheers everyone, bye-bye.